At midnight, my Stepson didn't see me walk in. He was talking to my wife in our dark garage. Yes, I already cut his brakes. See you at his funeral, he said. I didn't scream. I stood in the shadows, clutching a greasy bag of Kroger chicken. The motor oil smell mixed with the warm fat in my hand. I slipped out, called a tow truck, and took the car straight to his dad. 2 hours later, the nightmare was just starting to breathe. My breath fogged the window of my old sedan. I watched the tow truck winch my F-150 onto the flatbed. The metal cable rattled like heavy chains against the pavement. Inside the house, the living room light stayed a soft, mocking yellow. Carol was probably sitting on the sofa, acting like a grieving widow before I was even dead. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Evan's phone screen glowed blue against his smug face in my mind. The drive to Dayton was a blur of orange streetlights and damp roads. Every time I hit the brakes, a phantom vibration traveled up my leg. I kept thinking about the tubing cutter Evan must have used. He always hated my lectures on HVAC maintenance. Now I knew why he stayed so quiet during our last argument. He wasn't listening to my advice. He was calculating the exact angle of the cut. Ray's house appeared like a brick fortress in the winter fog. Ray didn't ask questions when I pounded on his door at 2 in the morning. He saw my shaking hands and the tow truck idling in his driveway. He grabbed a flashlight and a creeper without saying a word. I stood in the cold air, watching his boots stick out from under my truck. The silence lasted too long. Finally, he rolled out and looked at me with hollow eyes. He held up a finger stained with fresh fluid. Even really did it, Ray whispered. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a text from Carol. She asked where I was. I didn't answer her. I stared at the cut line under the flashlight's beam. It was a surgical slice, clean and deliberate. Ray stood up and wiped his hands on a rag that was already black with grease. He looked like he wanted to cry for his son but chose justice instead. We called the police together. The dispatcher's voice sounded bored until I mentioned the premeditated murder. By dawn, the police lights were swirling over the garage door. The officers took photos of the sabotage while I sat on a folding chair. My throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. I checked my messages one last time. Carol had sent a final text claiming she was worried about my mental health. She was already building the lie to cover the crime. I looked at the lead officer and told him everything. He nodded and reached for his handcuffs. This was the end of my family. The handcuffs clicked with a finality that echoed through the cold garage. I watched the younger officer lead Evan toward the squad car. He didn't look back at me. His broad shoulders were slumped, but his jaw remained tight. Carol stood by the workbench, her face a mask of crumbling pale makeup. She reached for the phone as if to call someone who could undo the truth. I stepped into her line of sight. Her hand froze midair. The lead detective handed me a small plastic bag containing a tubing cutter. It looked brand new, the blade still gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. I recognized the brand from my own shop. Evan had likely used my discount account to buy the tool meant for my murder. My stomach churned as I imagined him standing over the truck yesterday. He had been smiling when I came home. Now that smile was recorded on the store security footage. We found the receipt in his jacket, the detective said quietly. I nodded and looked at the concrete floor. The grease stains looked like dark ink. Carol finally spoke, her voice thin and high. She claimed she didn't know he would actually go through with it. It was a weak defense that made the air feel heavy. I realized she had been waiting for the crash to happen. She wanted the life insurance and the house without the blood. A secondary officer walked in holding a tablet. He showed me a series of texts between Carol and her son. They started weeks ago. They discussed my health, my habits, and my routine. The words were clinical and cold. They planned the funeral before they even cut the line. My hands began to shake again. I looked at the woman I had shared a bed with for 11 years. She was a stranger wearing a familiar face. You need to leave the property, Frank, the detective advised. The house was now a crime scene, and I was the primary target. I grabbed my toolbox from the corner. It was the only thing in this garage that truly belonged to me. Carol tried to step toward me, but the officer blocked her path. She started to sob, but there were no tears in her eyes. It was just a performance for the local neighborhood audience. I walked to my sedan and threw the toolbox in the back. The neighborhood felt different under the gray morning light. Porch lights were clicking off as people woke up to the news. I saw Mrs. Keller watching from her window. She had already seen the police cars. The rumors would be halfway down the block by noon. I didn't care about the gossip anymore. I just wanted to find a place where I could finally sleep. Image of a hydraulic car brake system diagram. The engine groaned as I pulled out of the driveway for the last time. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a notification from the bank. Someone had tried to transfer funds from our joint account 10 minutes ago. Carol was already moving the money while the police were in her kitchen. She wasn't grieving or scared. She was looting the wreckage of our life. I drove toward the highway and didn't look in the mirror. The motel room smelled like stale cigarettes and lemon bleach. I sat on the edge of the polyester bedspread with my laptop humming. The bank alert was still blinking red on my phone screen. Carol was efficient. She had cleared $3,000 from our savings before the sun was even fully up. My hands were steady now, fueled by a cold, sharp clarity. I needed to block her access before the entire retirement fund vanished into thin air. I called the branch manager, a man named Miller who had handled our mortgage. He sounded hesitant, his voice dipping into a low, professional murmur. He had already seen the morning news report about the arrest in Riverside. Public shame was a heavy weight in a town this small. He told me he could flag the accounts, but a full freeze required a legal order. He warned me that Carol was already at the downtown branch. She was not alone. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. If Carol was at the bank, then the police had already processed her statement and let her go. She was walking free while Evan sat in a holding cell. I grabbed my car keys and headed for the door. My objective was clear. I had to reach the bank before she could sign over our joint equity. The drive was a blur of gray concrete and winter trees. The downtown branch was a limestone building that looked like a tomb. I pulled into the lot and saw Carol's silver SUV parked near the entrance. A man in a dark suit was standing beside her driver's side window. It wasn't Evan. It was a lawyer I recognized from local television ads. They were talking intensely, their heads close together. Carol looked different without her church sweater. She looked sharp, dangerous, and entirely focused on the money. I stepped out of my car and the cold air bit at my face. Carol saw me immediately. She didn't flinch or look guilty. She simply nodded to her lawyer and pointed in my direction. The man stepped forward, holding a leather briefcase like a shield. He told me I was in violation of a temporary restraining order Carol had filed an hour ago. My heart stopped. She had flipped the script. I was now the dangerous aggressor in the eyes of the law. The lawyer handed me a folded set of papers. He claimed I had a history of erratic behavior and verbal abuse. It was a calculated lie designed to keep me away from the assets. Carol watched from the safety of her vehicle, her eyes cold and empty. She had used my silence from the night before against me. By not screaming or fighting, I had given her the room to play the victim. The power had shifted completely. I looked at the papers, and then back at the limestone building. My phone buzzed again with a new message. It wasn't from the bank this time. It was a private number. The text was a single photo of the F-150 in the impound lot. Someone had painted a red target on the driver's side door. It was a message from Evan's friends. The arrest hadn't ended the threat. It had only moved the war into the shadows. I backed away from the bank entrance. The restraining order felt like a physical weight in my hand. Carol's lawyer watched me with a bored expression. He knew the law was currently on his side. I looked at the silver SUV and saw Carol rolling up her window. She was shutting me out of our shared history. My blood ran cold as the reality of the situation settled in. I had the truth, but she had the paperwork. I drove back toward the motel, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The red target photo on my phone felt like a ticking bomb. Someone was watching me from the shadows of Evan's social circle. I needed professional help. My HVAC background taught me that you can't fix a ruptured line with tape. I called Martha Klein, the toughest attorney in the county. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was like gravel and steel. We met at a roadside diner 10 miles outside of town. Martha took the restraining order and scanned it while sipping black coffee. She didn't look impressed by the legal jargon. She told me Carol was playing a dangerous game of preemptive strikes. We needed to counter with the physical evidence from Ray's garage. Martha reached into her bag and pulled out a digital recorder. She had a copy of the 911 call from the night before. The recording played with a hiss of static. I heard Ray's voice clearly describing the clean cut in the brake line. Then, the dispatcher asked for the suspect's name. Ray hesitated for a second before saying Evan's name. It was the sound of a father betraying his own blood for the truth. Martha paused the audio and looked at me. She had a small, sharp smile. We had a witness that Carol's high-priced lawyer couldn't intimidate. "We go to the judge this afternoon," Martha said. She explained that a criminal investigation into attempted murder trumped a civil restraining order. We just had to prove that Carol was a flight risk. I told her about the bank transfers and the sudden disappearance of our savings. Martha's eyes narrowed as she made a note on her legal pad. She loved a fight where the villain left a paper trail. The momentum was finally starting to shift. I left the diner feeling a sliver of hope. The winter sun was beginning to drop, casting long shadows across the highway. I stopped at a gas station to fill my tank. As I stood by the pump, a black truck pulled in behind me. It had no front plate and tinted windows. My heart skipped a beat as the driver's door opened slightly. I saw a pair of heavy work boots hit the pavement. The driver didn't get out to pump gas. He just stood there, watching me through the gap in the door. I finished fueling and walked toward the cashier's booth. I could feel his eyes on the back of my neck. When I looked back, the truck was gone, leaving only a smell of burnt rubber. I reached into my pocket and found a small, jagged piece of metal. Someone had tucked a cut brake line fragment under my wiper. I gripped the metal fragment until it bit into my palm. The jagged edge was a cold promise of more violence to come. I drove straight to Martha's office, ignoring the speed limit. My objective was simple. I needed a protective order to neutralize Carol's lies. The pressure was mounting as the sun dipped below the horizon. Every headlight in my rearview mirror felt like a predator closing in for the kill. I had to strike back legally now. Martha was waiting by the elevator, her expression grim. She took the cut line fragment and placed it in an evidence bag. She told me the black truck was registered to a shell company. He even had connections I never bothered to investigate during our quiet dinners. The power balance was shifting toward a hidden network of old grudges. Martha led me into a small conference room. A stack of financial records sat on the table like a paper wall. "Carol just emptied the safety deposit box," Martha said. She showed me a digital log from the bank branch. Carol had checked in 30 minutes ago using her secondary ID. She was liquidating our lives into untraceable cash and jewelry. The mid-scene turn was clear. She wasn't just hiding, she was preparing to run. My chest tightened as I realized our shared history was being stuffed into a suitcase. She was erasing me one asset at a time. I sat down and forced myself to breathe slowly. The HVAC technician in me wanted to find the leak and seal it. Martha explained that we could file an emergency motion to freeze her passport. We needed a judge to sign off before the airport became her exit. The primary obstacle was the time of day. Most courts were closing their doors for the night. We were racing against a clock that didn't care about my survival. Martha grabbed her phone and started barking orders to her clerk. She was a force of nature when a client was being hunted. I looked at the surveillance photo of Carol leaving the bank. She wore a dark wig and oversized sunglasses to hide her face. The subtext was undeniable. She had been planning this exit long before the garage incident. The murder wasn't just about hate. It was a very lucrative business transaction for her. "We have a hearing at 8 tonight," Martha announced. A judge had agreed to see us in chambers due to the murder charges. I felt a surge of adrenaline as we left the office. We drove through the city, the neon signs blurring into streaks of light. I kept checking the shadows for the black truck. The threat was still out there, waiting for a mistake. We reached the courthouse and moved toward the high-security entrance. The lobby was empty and echoed with every step we took. We cleared the metal detector and headed for the 3rd floor. I saw Carol's lawyer standing near the elevators, looking frantic. He was pacing and shouting into his cell phone about a missed flight. My heart skipped a beat as I realized Carol wasn't with him. She had ditched her own legal counsel. She was already gone. leaving only a cryptic note in her husband's name. The note sat on the courtroom bench. It was a single sheet of ivory stationery with my name scrawled in her elegant cursive. Martha snatched it before I could touch the paper. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the 3 lines of text. She didn't read it aloud to me. Instead, she handed it to the bailiff with a look of pure disgust. The judge appeared through the side door. He looked tired and annoyed by the late hour. Carol was missing. We stood as the judge took his seat. Martha immediately moved for an arrest warrant and a travel ban. She presented the financial records, showing the emptied safety deposit box. The judge leaned over his bench, peering at the evidence through heavy glasses. He asked the defense lawyer where his client had gone. The man in the shiny suit could only stutter about a sudden family emergency. He looked like a man realized he wouldn't be getting paid for this job. The room felt cold despite the humming radiators. I sat behind Martha, watching the clock on the oak wall. Each tick felt like a hammer hitting a nail. My objective was to secure the warrant before she crossed the state line. The primary obstacle was the judge's insistence on following every minor procedural rule. He wanted to ensure the paperwork was perfect. He didn't want a mistrial later. I tapped my fingers on my knee, fighting the urge to yell. Martha pivoted toward the witness stand. She pulled out the recording of Ray's call again. This time, she focused on a detail we had ignored earlier. There was a sound in the background of the call. It was a distinctive mechanical hum I recognized instantly. It was the sound of a specific generator used only at the lake cabin. Carol wasn't at a motel or her sister's house. She was hiding at the one property I hadn't checked yet. The judge listened to the hum and looked at me for confirmation. I nodded once, my jaw tight with a new realization. That cabin was remote and had no cell service. It was the perfect place to burn documents and wait for a pickup. The power balance shifted as the judge finally grabbed his pen. He signed the emergency order and handed it to the clerk. He looked at the defense lawyer with cold eyes. "Your client is officially a fugitive," he said. We ran to the parking lot. The winter wind was howling between the stone pillars of the courthouse. Martha told me to stay put, but I was already in my car. I couldn't let the police handle this alone. I knew the shortcuts through the woods that a squad car would miss. I drove toward the lake, my headlights cutting through the swirling snow. The road was a narrow ribbon of black ice and danger. I didn't care about the risk. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking the frozen water. I parked a quarter-mile away and walked the rest. The snow crunched under my boots, sounding like breaking glass. I saw a faint glow in the kitchen window. The black truck from the gas station was parked in the brush. Someone was helping her pack the last of the stolen cash. I reached the porch and pulled my heavy wrench from my belt. It was the only weapon I had. I peeked through the glass. Carol was sitting at the table, counting stacks of hundreds. She looked different in the candlelight. The soft wife I knew was gone. She was replaced by a woman who looked like a predatory bird. The man from the truck stood by the door, checking his watch. He had a holster clipped to his belt. They were waiting for a boat to cross the lake. The water was their only clear path out of the county. I didn't wait for the police sirens. I moved toward the generator shed behind the cabin. If I cut the power, the security lights would die. I opened the panel and found the main breaker. My hands were steady as I gripped the switch. I pulled it down and the ridge went pitch black. I heard the man inside the cabin shout an oath. Carol screamed my name into the dark. They knew I was out there in the freezing night. I stepped back into the trees and waited. A moment later, the cabin door swung open. The man stepped out with a high-powered flashlight. He swept the beam across the snowy yard, searching for a target. I stayed low, using the trunk of an old oak for cover. My heart was a drum in my ears. As the light passed over me, I saw something in the snow. It was a second set of footprints leading toward my car. I wasn't the hunter. The secondary footprints were fresh, cutting deep into the crust of the snow. I realized then that Evan had not been processed alone. Someone had posted his bail during the chaos at the courthouse. He was here, acting as the silent muscle Carol needed to vanish. My objective shifted from capture to basic survival. I pressed my back against the rough bark of the oak tree. The man with the flashlight moved toward the generator shed, leaving Carol alone in the cabin. I bypassed the porch and crept toward the side window. Inside, Carol was shoving the last bundles of cash into a waterproof duffel bag. Her hands were shaking, but her face remained cold. She looked like she was shedding a skin she had worn for a decade. I saw a flare of movement in the kitchen mirror. It was Evan, holding a heavy tire iron. He wasn't counting money. He was watching the door with a predator's focus. He wanted me. The man outside shouted something about a tripped circuit. Evan didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his silhouette framed by the dying embers in the fireplace. I knew I couldn't outrun a bullet or outfight two younger men with a wrench. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold plastic of the generator remote. I had installed a secondary bypass switch years ago for winter storms. I pressed the override. The external security floodlights suddenly roared to life with a blinding white flash. The man by the shed screamed and shielded his eyes. Ivan lunged toward the window, thinking the glass was about to shatter. I didn't wait for him to recover. I sprinted toward the black truck, my boots kicking up plumes of frozen powder. I needed to disable their only means of escape before the light faded. I reached the front tire and jammed my heavy wrench into the brake assembly. The metal groaned as I wedged it tight against the rotor. They were grounded now. Image of a car disc brake assembly showing the rotor and caliper. "Adam!" Carol's voice pierced the thin walls of the cabin. She had seen me through the glass. She sounded desperate, like a cornered animal realizing the cage had shrunk. I heard the front door slam open against the siding. Avon was down the steps in seconds, his boots thudding on the wooden porch. I dove behind the rear of the truck, the smell of diesel and cold metal filling my lungs. The man with the flashlight was recovering, his beam swinging wildly. The spotlight on the shed flickered and died. The bypass had burned out the old wiring. We were plunged back into a world of shifting shadows and gray moonlight. I heard the man from the shed racking the slide of a handgun. The sound was a sharp, mechanical click that made my skin crawl. He wasn't a friend of Evan's. He was hired help with a professional's lack of hesitation. I realized then that Carol hadn't just stolen our savings. She had borrowed money. I stayed low, crawling through the brush toward the frozen shoreline. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest. If I could reach the old boathouse, I could signal the police across the water. The snow was getting deeper, slowing my progress. I heard Evan's voice close by, a low and jagged murmur. He was mocking me, calling out my name like a dark childhood game. He knew I was unarmed. He knew every inch of this ridge as well as I did. I reached the boathouse and slipped through the sagging door. It smelled of rotting cedar and old gasoline. I found the emergency flare kit bolted to the wall near the winch. My fingers were numb, fumbling with the plastic seal. I heard the crunch of snow right outside the thin wooden planks. Someone was breathing heavily on the other side. I finally ripped the kit open and pulled out a single red flare. It felt like a small, warm sun. "Come out, Adam," Evan whispered. He was standing just inches away, separated only by the rotted siding. I held the flare ready, my thumb hovering over the striker. I could see the light of the man's flashlight reflecting off the ice through the cracks in the floor. They were closing the circle. I had no more tools and no more tricks. I had to decide if I was willing to burn the truth down to save myself. I struck the flare. The red light erupted, filling the boathouse with a thick, choking smoke. I kicked the door open and shoved the burning flare directly into the man's face. He fell back, howling as the sparks hit his eyes. I didn't stop to look at his injuries. I turned toward the lake and saw something that froze the blood in my veins. A second boat was already idling in the middle of the bay. It wasn't the police. It was another black truck on water. The flare sputtered, casting a hellish crimson glow over the frozen bay. That second boat wasn't coming to rescue anyone. It was a recovery team for the money Carol had stolen. I realized then that my life was a footnote in their balance sheet. Evan lunged through the smoke, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage. He swung the tire iron, catching me across the shoulder. The bone groaned under the impact. I fell back against the rotted cedar wall. Pain flared, but the HVAC technician in me remained cold and precise. I had to reach the main winch before they boarded the boathouse. The heavy steel cable was the only anchor left in this sinking world. I rolled toward the rusted crank, ignoring the fire in my arm. Evan stepped closer, his boots crunching on the oil-stained planks. He didn't see the tension in the line. He only saw a broken old man. He raised the iron for a final strike. I kicked the release lever with my heel. The winch roared, the sudden tension snapping the steel cable across the room like a whip. It caught Evan across the chest, throwing him back through the rotted doors. He hit the ice with a sickening thud. The man with the flare, burned eyes was still screaming near the shed. I grabbed the radio from the boathouse shelf and keyed the emergency frequency. The signal was weak, but it was a lifeline. Blue and red lights finally crested the ridge above the cabin. Martha had kept her promise to send the state troopers. I watched from the shadows as the officers swarmed the porch with rifles drawn. Carol walked out with her hands up, the duffel bag of cash abandoned on the kitchen table. She looked small and frail in the cold searchlight. The predatory bird had been clipped. She didn't look at Evan or the black boat. She only looked for me. The detectives processed the scene while a paramedic bandaged my shoulder. They found the secondary ledger inside Carol's waterproof bag. It contained names and dates of every debt Evan had ever incurred. She hadn't been helping him out of love. She was using him as a shield for her own embezzling. My wife had been a ghost in my own home for a decade. The truth was finally sitting on a legal pad. I signed the statement with a shaking hand. Weeks later, I sat on my new balcony watching the great Miami River flow toward the horizon. The divorce was final, and the bank had recovered most of the retirement funds. Evan and Carol were awaiting trial in separate counties. I took a deep breath of the damp morning air. The weight of the lie had finally lifted from my chest. My phone buzzed with an unknown caller. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I turned it off.